Hello. In 2022, war returned to Europe. Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, and that action has had a profound and lasting effect on the world. The Russian attack forced millions of people from their homes and caused a global food and energy crisis, and will continue to impact millions around the world for years to come. Now, over the past 10 months, Sky's defence and security analyst, Professor Michael Clark, has been giving us his insight as to how the war has played out. I'm Kamali Melbourne, and in the next 30 minutes, Michael will be giving us his expert opinion on the key elements of the war in Ukraine and on what could come next. But before we begin, let's take a look at the key moments of the war so far.
The shelling is very close.
The wreckage of Russian vehicles is littering this street.
Here we go.
It started before dawn.
Can you hear that, Mark?
It's the only way out of Irpin, and this would test even the fit and healthy. But those still fleeing are the most vulnerable.
They are going west to safety. He will now head east to fight.
There is going to be one almighty crush as people try to get on.
Right, it's going up behind you now.
Whatever fell from the sky made a crater this big.
Alex Crawford from Sky News.
Close the sky and stop bombing. Don't speak about the bureaucratic steps.
You can see what's left of the missile here. The words on the side of that, Zadeti, it means for children.
This is what it's like in Kharkiv every day.
At first, we were scared, really scared. But now we are ready to fight. Fight like hell.
Precious monuments are now shrouded in sandbags.
So through here, they're making the Molotov cocktails.
Vladimir Putin thought that Russian forces would capture Kyiv within days. They failed. Instead, his forces are bogged down in a war that they're unwilling to leave and so far incapable of winning.
They're very grateful to see something that they didn't think they would see for perhaps a long time, if ever at all.
Well, the war began on the 24th of February. Its lead-up was months, if not years, in the making. Before we begin, Michael, let's just understand Ukraine in Europe and where it finds itself.
Yes, it's the biggest land area in Europe, apart from Russia itself, so it's the biggest country, 44 million people, so again, it's quite large and it's potentially very rich, not so rich these days, but it is potentially very rich, and it has the great Dnieper River running through it, and that divides the country into a sort of an eastern third, which is more industrial and more Russian influenced in its history, and a western two-thirds, which is much more agricultural and more influenced by Poland and Lithuania in history. So it's an interesting country and a major country in Europe as and when it catches up with West European economies.
Yeah, and tell us about the man prosecuting this war, the man who decided to invade President
Vladimir Putin. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, he was in Dresden as the KGB chief in a small town. He was appalled by what he saw. He thought it was a catastrophe that the Soviet Union had broken up. And it was Ukraine that effectively broke up the Soviet Union. It was their demands for independence that created the momentum that broke up the rest. He never forgave them for that, never accepted that Ukraine could be an independent country, had his own view of Russian history. There was a crisis in 2014 when Ukraine began to lean much too far, he thought, to the European Union. And out of that crisis, they occupied Crimea by force. They occupied parts of the Donbass, about a third of it, with these separatist territories. And that gave him the beginnings of a war. In 2022, for a range of other reasons, he thought the moment was right. And this common land border, 2,000 kilometers, then becomes very important because the Russians sent, for the third time, a series of exercises into Belarus and into Western Russia. And these exercises, they said, oh, it's just an exercise. And the West was saying, well, these don't look just like exercise. It looks as if you plan to do something. No, no, just an exercise. The troops themselves thought they were only on exercise, so they didn't really prepare properly. They sold a lot of their equipment. They didn't get themselves ready. Only 3 people around Putin, 72 hours before the invasion, knew what he intended. Even Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, he didn't know until 3 days before. And then on the 24th of February, suddenly these exercises became an invasion. They crossed the 2,000-kilometer border, and for Kiev, There's no way of defending yourself against that.
No, and with all that build-up, how did Kiev defend itself? How did they prepare themselves in those?
Well, militarily, they tried to defend themselves by going back to basics after 2014, that crisis, and they began to build a Western-style army based on Western principles. But the political class, they just pretended it wasn't happening. They really didn't want to hear this, so they listened to those people who said, no, this is just an exercise. They wanted to believe the Russians, and effectively, they just ran out of rope. And it was 24 hours before the invasion, before Kiev really understood what was about to happen. It was so awful, they just couldn't believe it would really take place.
So as the war broke out, Michael, let's examine where we are 6 days into the fighting. What's the situation?
Yeah, after 6 days, all these red areas represented parts where the Russians were making progress. They were clearly making progress in the south because they were coming from Crimea, where their lines of communication were much shorter and their forces were better. So they were doing as they would have expected to do here. And around these other areas, they were making progress, and we all expected these to turn into arrows of quite big advances. And when people were discussing what are the Russians going to do, we thought what they will probably do is try to take all of the land east of the Dnieper River. That would be logical. They would then say, this is ours, and then start a discussion about what would happen to the rest of Ukraine, try and make it into effectively an unviable state. That seemed to be logical. We thought that this was getting off to a slightly slow start, but we fully expected this whole area east of the Dnieper to turn red within a matter of weeks.
Right, let's focus in now on the capital, because of course to take the country they would have wanted to take Kiev, and there was a key battle held just outside the Ukrainian capital in and around Hostomel Airport.
Hostomel Airport. That was really critical. The Russians put their paratroopers into Hostomel Airport in the early hours. The job was get into Hostomel, go to Kiev, get hold of the government, kill Zelensky and anybody else around him, and then get more troops into Hostomel to take control of the capital. Once you're in control of the capital, 72 hours is what they expected, we'll then suppress any problems we have in Sumy and Chernihiv within a few weeks. The Russians felt that by about the 8th or 10th of March, it would all be over. And that was the idea. Their failure to take Hostomel, or to hold it, they took it, and then the Ukrainians got it back within hours. That failure cost them the rapid strategy that might otherwise have worked.
And how many airborne troops did they manage to land at Hostomel?
Well, it was a couple of battalions worth originally, and then they were going to flood troops into the place with air power and helicopters and so on. Once you've got an airfield, you can do all sorts of things with it. You can get thousands and thousands of troops and equipment in. But the fact that they didn't hold it meant that they were having to operate from long distances, and critically, Kiev just didn't give in. And the fact was, a lot of saboteurs in Kiev, a lot of Spetsnaz people who were designed actually to create trouble. There's an awful lot of rough justice, a lot of firing at night in the streets. We still don't know the story of all of that. I think it will emerge that a lot of people were killed out of hand as the Ukrainians actually suppressed these sabotage squads that were in place already.
And these early days, Michael, people will remember that this was the moment where we saw that traffic jam on the way down into Kiev, coming out from the Pripyat marshes. Tell us about that and how significant that was.
Yes, quite quickly, this big column came across the Pripyat marshes, and it was coming southwards. And we all thought, OK, this is the encirclement of Kiev. This will come south and encircle Kiev. Forces from Sumy, who were making quite good progress, they'll encircle from the east, and Kiev will be completely encircled, and then we'll see what happens. Will the Russians dare to bombard it, this great city founded in 482? Would they really bombard a city that ancient, much older than Moscow, or will they just squeeze it? We didn't know. The fact is, they didn't get close to surrounding it because the convoy stopped of its own volition, ran out of fuel, ran out of ammunition. Its tyres were all shredded because they were cheap Chinese tyres, and the Ukrainians attacked it in all the right ways. They attacked its logistics, they attacked all the things that they needed, and so the convoy eventually simply had to withdraw. It was a huge embarrassment. The Russians tried to pretend it was all intended, but of course it wasn't. It was a defeat.
And this was only 6 days in. What were experts like you thinking when you saw that the Spetsnaz landed at Hostomel, this convoy hadn't moved? What did experts think about the way Russia was prosecuting this war?
Yeah, we thought they were making hard work of it, but they would not fail, because a country like Russia doesn't fail in these sorts of things. They'll do it roughly, but they will do it. We couldn't believe that they'd make such a hash of it for so long.
We're now in the 10th month of the invasion, of course, but Michael, let's go back to the first full calendar month of the war, the 31st of March. Describe for us the situation at that point.
Kamali, by then, it had turned into a sort of war of the cities. The original strategy, take Kiev within 72 hours and finish it, that had failed. And so now the Russians seem to be occupying or the area around cities. They weren't able to get into them, couldn't get into Kharkiv, couldn't get it. They did get into Kherson, but other cities they weren't able to get into, and so they stood outside of them. Kherson was the only city that they took, mainly because it was sort of given to them by collaborators in effect, and that was the only important city that they had. And in a sense, this was almost like 4 separate campaigns, 4 different areas, all run by local commanders. Nobody was in overall control. We were watching this and thinking, we can't really see the strategy behind this. This was just activity almost for its own sake. Didn't seem to be going anywhere.
That's on the Russian side, no overall strategy. But let's move to the summer and the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because there was some definite strategy behind this and some pre-planning.
Yes, by the summer, the Russians had taken Severodonetsk after 100 days of attack, and then they quite quickly took Lysychansk. This was actually the only good bit of manoeuvre warfare they conducted. They got behind Ukrainian defenders of Lysychansk. They had a good defensive position, the Ukrainians. They had to give it up or they were going to get surrounded, so they moved back. And we all thought, OK, the next battle is the final battle for the Donbass, which is Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Sloviansk, very important symbolically. That's where the 2014 revolt started by the Luhansk People's Republic. And Kramatorsk is the centre for road and rail, particularly railways. If the Russians took that, then they get the rest of the Donbass. And the Ukrainians had made a fortress of both of those places. So we thought, right, that's the next battle. But actually, the Russians didn't get any further than Lysychansk. This was the high watermark of their advance in the Donbass.
Yeah, the Ukrainians were able to punch through in that part of the east, while at the same time, they were also focusing in on trying to retake Kherson.
They were. They talked about retaking Kherson quite a lot, and we all thought, well, OK, well, it's a neat trick if you can do it, see how long it takes you. But while they were talking about that, they persuaded the Russians, mainly Putin, to transfer troops from the Donbass down to Kherson, and then the Ukrainians hit them in the Donbass, and they retook Izium. Izium had been a very important centre for the Ukrainians. The Russians had taken it, were basing their forces from Izium. The Ukrainians took it back, and they pushed them right back until they were fighting then on the edge, effectively, of Severodonetsk by the end of the year. And that offensive has been extraordinarily effective.
And Michael, by this point, as we can see on the map here, Mariupol on the Sea of Azov is in Russian hands, and that was a long and grinding battle for that city.
It became the sort of symbol of the war, the David and Goliath war. I was always saying at the beginning, I thought Mariupol would fall within hours. It should have done, because it was right on the edge of the battle area, but it didn't. And I don't know how they kept on fighting at Mariupol, but they did. Mainly the Marines and the Azov regiment and a couple of other units. And the Russians became obsessed with the Azov-style steelworks. The Ukrainians disappeared into the steelworks, which had lots of underground bunkers built by the Soviets in case of a nuclear attack. There's no way they could be winkled out of there. And instead of just screening Mariupol and then moving on, which is where the Russians needed to send their forces north, they became almost obsessed with it. And so it became a symbol of the war. And although Mariupol was eventually taken by the Russians, the survivors of Mariupol are now the sort of Ukrainian heroes of this war, and they will be for a couple of generations.
Right, let's move on now from the summer and to autumn going into winter, and this is the moment where Ukraine were able to retake that city of Kherson on the 12th of November.
Yes, the Ukrainians had launched these large attacks around Snehovivka, but about 60 kilometers wide, very ambitious, and we thought, will they really be able to get through there? But what they were reflecting was the fact that the Russians had failed to take Mykolaiv earlier in the war, and by failing to take Mykolaiv, and therefore they couldn't get on to Odessa further west, that meant that all of these troops who were west of the Dnieper were not doing any good. What were they there for, other than to occupy more or less empty ground? And the Russian generals wanted to withdraw them. Putin said no, at least twice that we're aware of. Eventually, the Ukrainians put them under enough pressure, particularly at Novokhovka, and then in Kherson itself, and the